Thanks, Frank, and congratulations on another good turnout this morning for the Desmond Greaves Summer School. Now, this morning's session is on national sovereignty and independence, interdependence. And our first speaker, we have 3 speakers. 2 will be using the screen. So for the first 2 speakers, we're going to leave the setup like this, and then for the later one is Mick O'Reilly, we'll go back to the tables, and then afterwards, after 3 speakers have spoken, anyone who wants to ask any questions, we'll have a question and answer session after 3 speakers have spoken, and they'll roughly speak for about 20 minutes each. So our first speaker this morning is Andy Storey, and Andy Storey is a lecturer in politics and international relations in UCD, and he's also chairperson of Afri, which is a very important NGO in Ireland, which does great work on development and the whole issues of controversial issues like militarisation, etc. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andy, and his particular session is sovereignty in a globalised world, which I think is very important because it's very difficult to know how you can remain sovereign within the modern globalised world that we exist in today, and how we can actually use that. So I'm going to hand over to Andy, and I'll give him about 5 minutes towards the end. So after about 15 minutes, I'll indicate that it's time to wrap up, so you'll have 5 minutes to wrap up. Okay, Andy, thanks.
Great. Okay, good morning. There was a bit of confusion as to whether this was sovereignty in a globalised world or sovereignty in a globalising world, and I decided to go for the latter. What I'm really going to talk about are some not terribly well pulled together thoughts on the role of nationalism and sovereignty, or claims to sovereignty, in the context of current political struggles. The first slightly pedantic point I want to make is that it is a globalising world in many important respects, but maybe not as much as we sometimes think. One could make the argument that at the turn of the 19th century, the world in many ways was more globalised in terms of colonial and imperial linkages. Most economic and political activity still takes place within and between rich countries, despite the emergence of emerging market economies. The US remains, if weakened, still very much the dominant world power, and regional and national identities, on which I'll say more anon, are often increasingly sharply defended, and there's no inevitability to globalisation or the interlinkages between global economies. They could easily be reversed by resurgent nationalisms or regionalisms in the context of the current crisis, and that, again, as we talk about in the Irish context, could be either positive or negative. At the same time, there is something in the argument of a globalising world. Global interaction certainly takes place at a much faster pace than has heretofore been the case. When the financial crisis or collapse occurred in 2007, 2008, we saw global stock markets all plummet within hours of each other, a process that actually took weeks in the context of the 1930s crash of 1929. And our actions anywhere do have consequences everywhere. And that brings with it additional or new responsibilities. And again, I want to kind of wrap up with that notion of what those responsibilities might constitute in the context of how one could exercise sovereignty in an increasingly globalised or globalising world. And I want to draw, for my discussion, moving to the more specific discussion of Irish sovereignty, or what Irish national sovereignty might or might not mean in the current context, to 2 recent books. One, Conor McCabe's Sins of the Father, and from which I'm about to steal its most arresting image in a moment, and the other, Maurice Coakley's Ireland in the World Order, A History of Uneven Development. Maurice is actually in the audience, and I can probably sell you copies of the book if you want. But I'm going to quote from that, because I think it posits the issue of nationalism and the national question, or the repositing of the national question, in an important political context in terms of current struggles. But to start with what is probably the most arresting image from Conor's book, and my apologies to Conor for stealing this, He in turn, however, would freely admit that he stole it from Arthur Cox solicitors. And this is an image from one of their brochures advertising Ireland to international investors. And basically Ireland is, this is not made up, this is not photoshopped, this is actually part of their brochure. Ireland is a special purpose vehicle through which investors essentially launder money and generate returns. And Conor has used this notion of Ireland as a kind of a middleman within global circuits of capital. And that, in a sense, while it's perhaps slightly simplified, is an arresting image, because it does capture an important truth about the way in which Ireland's elite constructed or almost substituted for a national development strategy in the second half of the 20th century. And that's where the other image, by the way, that I could have used there is the title of a report that our next speaker, Sheila Killian, wrote for the Debt and Development Coalition Ireland, called Driving the Getaway Car, Ireland and the Facilitation of Tax Evasion Internationally, which is part of what that middleman role has been. But these are this is a quote from Morris's book: "The closer integration of North Atlantic capitalism in the second half of the 20th century offered, in a sense, almost an answer to the perennial problem confronting the Irish ruling class as to how you escape from underdevelopment while at the same time not having an actual development strategy." Or in an earlier era where development strategies were seen as being inevitably premised on asserting greater national independence, in particular obviously in terms of the anti-colonial struggle, where political control was seen as vital to avoid economic decline or to promote economic development. Development in the second half of the 20th century could be achieved, or a version of development could be achieved, through subordination of Irish sovereignty to the requirements of North American and European capital, in particular, of course, by becoming a bridgehead for US capital accessing the EU market and banking bogus profits as a result of Ireland's tax haven status. And that subordination, which to a certain extent worked for a period of time, now faces a serious political problem, because to continue to subordinate one's interests to the requirements of international capital, in particular in terms of the repayment of bondholder debt, requires the immiserization or pauperization of Irish society. So this worked to a certain extent for a period of time, but now runs up against the problem of the elite having to very openly and overtly take sides with external interests against the interests of the vast majority of Irish people. And that again, to again use two other quotes, I think these are the last quotes from your book, Morris, so the free publicity ends here. But one of the ironies, as Morris points out, of the current situation is that sovereignty and national democracy, which for so long had been deemed antiquated and irrelevant in the context of a globalizing world and a Celtic Tiger economy, those have re-emerged as pressing claims in popular discourse, and I'll talk about two of those claims in particular. To say, of course, however, that the national question has been forcibly reasserted by the crisis doesn't mean it can be answered in a purely national way. And again, that notion of the global dimension to the exercise of sovereignty is something I want to emphasise myself, and not just in Ireland. But of course it also seems reasonable to assume that 21st century Europe will see a reassertion of claims of sovereignty and popular democracy linked to struggles against impoverishment. So in a sense, the national question is coming back in a big way in many jurisdictions. And while I expect many people here have no great difficulty with that in terms of the legacy of Desmond Greaves, that does raise fears on the part of some people in terms of where a nationalist discourse might go and some of the dangers and perils that lie within it. And a lot of what I'm saying here is really rehashing in fairly poor form, I suspect, debates that have been going on the left for many decades and indeed centuries in terms of the link between democracy and nationalist claims. The fear might be that the way in which nationalism will resurface in the context of the current crisis will be as a kind of a morbid symptom, in the sense that Gramsci described it, that where you have a crisis where the old is dying and the new is not yet ready to be born, you have the possibility of a great variety of morbid symptoms appearing. And those morbid symptoms might take a nationalist form. We already can see that in terms of elite discourse, where a kind of a bowdlerized version of national democracy is embodied in quotes like "we all partied," or putting on the green jersey in terms of subordinating class interests to some claimed national interest. But you could also have an even more extreme reactionary, exclusionary, racist nationalism arising in Ireland and perhaps there also. And you could certainly see strains of that. When I was desperately looking for inspiration for this talk, I actually Googled Irish sovereignty at one stage. And the first two hits are the 32 county sovereignty movement, but the next one up is Sovereign Independent, which some of you may be familiar with, which does a lot of work on issues like resources and so on, but from a rather odd angle. And this is a quote from a recent newsletter of Sovereign Independent, talking about having to republish extra copies of their most recent newsletter, especially for distribution around religious settings, because its discussion of how Catholic prophecies relate to the New World Order had obviously struck a chord with many people, especially of interest to Catholic troop groups. I haven't photoshopped this one either, I assure you. This is for real. And taking this around to, with all due respect to the Pilgrims of the Lamb, this is a potentially cul-de-sac in terms of an assertion of sovereignty, or what sovereignty might mean. So obviously, that may seem like a slightly far out and eccentric version of it, but there may be some truth in the fact that 10,000 extra copies were needed. So there is an appeal there that is potentially problematic. At the same time, there is no way of avoiding the national claim or the sovereign claim when it comes to particular political struggles. Two of those that I've been involved in. Sorry, I was going to retrieve some water here, but that I've been involved in the last few years are the campaign against illegitimate debt and the issues around natural resources, with particular reference to the dispute around the Corrib gas field. And in both those cases, there is an implicit or explicit assertion of sovereignty against foreign-initiated exploitation. In the case of Anglo, I'm not going to rehash the details of these two campaigns. I suspect they're well known to people here. The focus on Anglo debt and the debt of Irish Nationwide Building Society is because this seems a particularly egregious and self-evident example of illegitimate debts that were run up by what are now zombie banks, run by people who were clearly corrupt chancers, but whose bills we are still picking up to the tune of 3.1 billion per annum, stretching out into the indefinite future. And I may be being overly cynical here, but I suspect are not, contrary to some newspaper reports, going to be resolved come October. And I think that was well encapsulated by the Irish Central newsletter's headline vis-a-vis the putative debt relief that was going to be on offer to Ireland in terms of this restructuring deal, which is that it's not going to come. We'll watch this space, and I'm going to be involved in campaigning around this for the next while, next couple of months. But I would imagine that any claimed deal is going to involve very minor concessions rather than an actual write-down of illegitimate debt as such. The way in which, I think implicitly, and this is not something that was kind of necessarily explicitly to the fore in the way in which we were trying to frame this campaign when we set it up earlier this year, but we adopted the slogan, borrowing Anglo's own former corporate logo, of Anglo, not our debt. This is one of those slogans that arose after 3 hours of discussion at a committee, and everybody thought it was brilliant at the time. It was a perfect compromise. In the cold light of day, everybody realised it's stupid. But you're kind of stuck with it then, because all other options have bitten the dust or been discarded through a